Hey everybody, welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. We are the Winter Spring 2024 class, and this is office hour 3. Nice to see everybody here. Thanks for being on time. Really appreciate it. We've got a couple of great questions from Nicholas. So we're going to be jumping into that and talking about syntropic agroforestry or syntropic farming or syntropic gardening. It seems like we can't quite decide on the name. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And if there aren't any additional questions, then we will chat about the next assignments. But before we start off, I just wanted to check with everybody. How's the class going? How's materials? How's the template? Is it more or less than you were expecting in both quantity and quality and all of those good things? What's been your experience thus far? Feel free to unmute or put yourself into the chat.
Okay, I can start. I think it's excellent. I've been sick, so I haven't had much opportunity to work lately, but I have a week off now, so hopefully I will get something done. But I think the template is very good because it forces you to go through everything thoroughly, and it helps you to know that you don't miss anything, which I think is easy to do when you're a beginner. Yeah, so I think it's just I'm very happy, but a bit exhausted. But it's okay.
Fair enough. Thanks very much, Erica. Anybody
Thank
else? How's the course going for you? How's the content, the flow, the process?
I think it's been totally doable for me, and it's been interesting. I like the way that it's kind of unfolded. I think at the beginning the template was hard for me. It was a lot of it was just a lot of tutorials about how to make things happen, and that was instead of like learning the content, and that was the only thing that I was kind of like, oh, okay. But I feel like I've kind of gotten past that, so it feels totally interesting and engaging, and I'm enjoying it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Courtney. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's like anything, there's that initial learning curve, and then once you've got the tools underhand, you can get back to the process. It's funny, for a long time, this class didn't have anything for submission requirements or anything. So it was like, submit what you want, how you want it to look, which is kind of the permaculture approach of Mollison when he started. And then a couple of us were like, well, we should probably have something to help people along. But with that comes that technological awareness or understanding, which, yeah, it's another step. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Well, I think it's good practice too, though, because it also makes you research your area, which I wouldn't have otherwise done if I wasn't filling out all this stuff and trying, so I think it's good.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very biophilic course in terms of raising your ecological literacy of your local area and understanding. And there's a lot more of that as you get deeper into the course. And part of that is it's a pedagogy approach. And part of it is there's a couple of instructors who are very focused on ecological literacy, which is great. And some of that applies to your assignments. And some of that is just like, people want you to know that. So there's that aspect of it as well. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? How's the course going for you?
Yeah, it's been going pretty good. I had a little bit of a struggle with the Google Slides at first. I'm not too great on the computer, but again, like she said, getting past the first little bit was a bit of a challenge, but now everything's starting to click. And yeah, I really like the information downloads that we're getting, and it's been well worth it so far.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathan. It's been fun working on your base map with you. And
yeah,
got a beautiful space.
Thank you. I appreciate your help with that.
Yeah. You're most welcome. Most welcome. Anybody else want to chime in?
Right. I would just comment that following the book as well as the the video lessons and the assignments have been like very, very related. It's well, the book goes into other topics sometimes, but it's been nice like to have those like 3 lines of content like simultaneous.
Nice. So they've supported each other as you're going throughout your education.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, I wouldn't say like completely, but it's been enough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a question because of the texts that are out there, you know, a lot of permaculture design courses, especially the 2-week intensive, either they will require you to buy, you know, the big, thick permaculture designer's manual, or they will reference it, or some of them will include it in the cost of the course. But the amount that you read it in an intensive course that can be up to, you know, 8, 10, 12 hours a day is very little. And so I think Andrew's approach and Marisha's approach when they were looking for a text is they wanted something that was more practical based, so that way people could get into design. But then you'd have to redesign the whole course around the book, which, you know, books are books for a reason. So I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Anybody else want to chime in? How the course is going? What's been going on? Your experience? Okay. All right. Well, we're just coming off of Carnival, so I'm very well rested to answer questions because I just got to enjoy a citywide water fight yesterday, which was fantastic. And what we will be chatting about today is Nicholas has some great questions about another process called syntropic agroforestry and how it matches and works with permaculture. And unless we have any more questions, and again, we've got the question and answer document there in the chat, and I'm just going to put it up again, so that way if anybody else is interested in throwing in a new question, they can, or you can unmute. You don't have to type it out. We can do that. And then at the end, if there aren't any other questions and we still have time, I'm going to go over the upcoming assignments because we start to get into some of the unique permaculture design tools within this conversation. All right, so, let's not show it on the one that I have 1,000 tabs open on. Let's not do that. Okay. All right. So from Nicholas, hi Javin. Last week I attended the Soil Summit and heard Ernst Gotsch talking about natural succession, planting variety and density, and intensive pruning to fertilize and activate growth hormones. Remember from my syntropic agroforestry course that agroforestry has a planning stage to select and distance the consortium of plants and space out from a placenta, the trees and plants in function and their growth rate, soil requirements, and crown diameter. However, after having planted a great variety of seeds and saplings in a very dense manner, there's a great amount of design afterward while maintaining the system. Observe how plants react and deciding how to prune. Use to mulch, which to graft, and which to let mature. Planting densities keep options open in the future. Question 1. How can the design evolve as a response of plants to their adaptation to the place they were planted in? So right off the bat, Nicholas, can you explain that a little bit more? Because I wasn't quite understanding what the core of the question was.
So in the planting plan, and I went ahead a little bit on the course, like I've seen like where should you plant this and that, right? So the question is specifically like what adaptation or what changes would you do in 1 year time or 5-year time, depending on how plants react. Like you planted like something that should block a specific sector, but that was very wet or very dry or whatever, and they didn't grow. So how could that change? And more specifically into agroforestry, how would those lines interact with the design?
Yeah, great question. Okay, I understand it a little better now. So one of the things that Mollison talked about was that permaculturalists were time scouts. And this was, at the time, a pretty revolutionary moment because instead of we're just planting for climax, which is what a lot of forestry outfits were doing, they were planting for long-term climax crops. And so they were planting what they wanted, and 30 years out, they were waiting for it. or they were planting for annual crops and it was basically just mining the soil. What Bill said was, we're going to see these different types of ecologies move through succession if we want to, depending on management, because all ecologies will move towards their climax ecology in one way, shape, or form. And there's no difference in terms of the value of the climax ecology of a native prairie to the climax ecology of a native forest. If that's the climax ecology, that's the climax ecology. So they both have an exceptional amount of value. But what we found is that as you develop systems or as you move systems along, if you're starting with disturbance, so if we've churned soil, if we've brought in fire, either specifically through anthropogenic fire, if we've had disturbance of fire, basically if we've had disturbance, then usually the genetic seed bank of the soil plus what's on the air and what's on animals then recolonize, and they basically start again with that genetic expression. And the plants that do well, that are in total sun, and they do well with no competition, and they're basically there to knit the forest floor, to knit the prairie floor, to knit the riparian area. That's what they do. And then they move through succession. And so we go from herbaceous ground cover, and then we move into a shrub element or thicket, and then we move into low, medium, and high canopy. And it's important to know this because we're a little bit ahead of the course. And so Nicholas is asking a really great question, but I want you to have a couple of first principles so we can go through it cognitively together. And so when we start to design systems, and this is one of the great examples of this is spot the fence line in the prairies of Canada, because for fences are little niche makers. Fences inherently have a shadow cast. Fences inherently hold snow a little bit longer, and fences are a place for perch for birds. And what do birds do when they fly away? They lighten the load. And when they drop their little fertility packets full of seeds, you end up usually with these really interesting linear forests all across the prairies that are directly on the old homesteading fence lines. So we have this process in which if we have the conditions for succession will happen. It just happens naturally. So people like Ernst Gotsch and others, natural sequence farming comes to mind. They have used that biological imperative to basically develop an agricultural system, so specifically cultivated by humans, to develop food in short order. So one of the great questions that Nicholas brings up is, when we start thinking about succession, we have to think about where we are going to end up. And so a lot of this permaculture design course is based around or built around the idea of what is it going to be. Now, what isn't required in this course due to its length is that we don't require you to do what's called successional planning or stage planning of the different types of strata that are coming up. One of the things that permaculture has done really well is what's called support planting or chaperone planting, where say we have a key species, a production species, I think in syntropic, it's called target. Those are the ones you want. The species, the companion species that support it in permaculture can outweigh the key species at 10 to 1 versus 9 to 1. So we might have a keystone species like an apple, and when we plant it initially, we may put a number of nitrogen fixers around it. We might put some grass suppression or some types of low herbaceous materials. So that way we crowd out and we shade out grass. And then as we move through succession, we might graduate that to either small shrubs or small bushes, either for key species for cultivation or for nitrogen fixation. One of the things that I'm a stickler for is having nitrogen fixation at 2 or more levels or stories within agroforestry, food forestry, whatever verbiage you want to use. So when we start off and we think about what it is we want, usually what I do is I start with what is the climax ecology of that area, and also what is the biome of that area. So all of North America has been divided into different ecoregions all the way down to level 4. It's not the same for the rest of the world. So when you get to that aspect of the assignment, you may find it a little bit more difficult to take a look at and find what that ecoregion is. But then we go back to the client interview. What's the desire for the site? And we go back to the climate. So what is that site supporting? And basically that flora and fauna of ecology is basically like it's like a blueprint. It's a flora and fauna blueprint. If I go into an area and I know that they have browsing or grazing animals, I know the browsing or grazing livestock that'll likely do well there and be supported by what's existing and what we may have to supplant for fodder. So our approach is take a look at what the maturity is going to be, design it for maturity, design where you want that system to be in that successional cycle. Know that if it's not canopy, if it's not climax ecology and canopy ecology, then you're going to have to maintain it, because generally those systems will self-select to bring animals and different types of seeds into it. And this is where David Polster, who I think we talked about briefly once before, David Polster, who worked for the Department of Transportation as a consultant in Canada, they were re-vegetating the Trans-Canada Highway, which is the highway that goes from east to west in Canada. And on all of these cut slopes where they're going through the Rocky Mountains and in other places in British Columbia and Alberta, the two western provinces on the west coast of Canada, they found that they were trying to move it back towards the climax ecology, which in a lot of those places is Doug fir and a little bit of spruce. And what they were doing is they were planting pot-grown trees, conifers, and they were planting wildflower mixes, just like you would see in the alpine. And that whole ecology was stalled and stuck because basically they'd turned over the soil, done all this earthworking to put in the highway, but the ecology was still back at disturbance or pioneer. And so what David did, he came along and he said, we need to start this with pioneer trees and pioneer species, and also some really interesting earthworking using what's called live staking, which is taking things like red osier dogwood, alder, and willow in North America, well, not North America, but let's say mid-states north, and doing live staking by basically cutting them during the rainy season, digging a hole with a piece of rebar, sticking a branch down and just letting it be and letting that to self-grow. So you can live stake the material. What he found was, and he has photos of this, where he's got the trees that were planted by the Department of Transportation, and then he has just his pioneer species that he planted, and conifer seeds, eventually at year 3 through 6, were introduced completely naturally by birds or by mammals. And those conifers outgrew the conifers that they had planted from the nursery. So they planted no conifers, they just planted deciduous trees and some support species mix, and then it developed. So I give you that story because when we start to think about succession, it's really about understanding where do we want to end within that succession of the ecology that's around us. And if we want to end there, we're going to have management and maintenance around it. So each plant, as you plant it, is going to create its own niche. It's going to create its own shade. It's going to create its own hot zone and wet zone. When we get to the plant design conversation, I usually do a little tutorial on how to design guilds and niches. But once we get to Gotsch's system, which is a very different approach, it's very linear. It starts off where the agroforestry, and he calls it agroforestry, even though you'll have like corn and grass. And so it's a different way of looking at agroforestry because the technical definition is we're working with trees and we're working with pasture or annual crop. And so basically what he does is he uses the growth of the grass initially to help support and shade the newly planted seeds of, let's say, the corn. He'll then cut the grass, allow the corn to grow up, and basically it's a support conversation to keep all of the land covered, which is another principle that we hold in permaculture, is to keep the ground covered and to disturb it as little as possible, which is definitely something he does. But then he graduates. So he has what's called placenta 1 and placenta 2, which is like the two wombs that will support the I think it's middle and higher, or climax or high emergence, something like that. He has a whole way of thinking and working with it, but it's succession in short order that for the first 4 to 5 years has a strong ability to produce annual crops and kitchen crops. But then after that transitions very strongly into forest, which we wouldn't necessarily call agroforestry after that. When you take a look, and I highly recommend people check out the videos on Ernst and Syntropic Agroforestry, specifically his farm and the establishment of it. And I'll try and find some selects and send them into the group there. but he's really changed a quite barren plot of land in Brazil into a forest. So to answer your question, in permaculture, what we do is we take a look at what the output or the end game is going to be, and then we walk it back through the successional stages of that, taking a look at the blueprint, the flora and fauna blueprint of that area, trying to keep with it as much as possible. And then usually going with 90 to 80% support species, knowing that we're either going to harvest them out and replant them, or they're going to be sacrificial. They're going to be chaperone plants. So we do this a lot with nitrogen fixation species. So one of the things I've been chastised for is using alder to support fruit trees. But the thing is, I'll cut the alder down to the ground and I'll use it as coppice agroforestry, where I'm cutting it using that piece of wood, but also allowing, when the alder has gone to flower, to drop all of its nitrogen directly into the area around its root zone, which is close enough to the apple to support it. So that process can be replicated depending on what species you're using over and over within the confines of whatever you're using. So the other thing I wanted to say is that syntropic agroforestry is completely compatible with permaculture, because permaculture, I think, as you're starting to realize, is it's a methodology, it's a design approach. In many ways, it's a way of life because it has an ethical foundation, whereas things like syntropic agroforestry really don't. In terms of outside of that agroforestry plot, permaculture can be applied to pretty much anything. Whereas the way that Ernst is doing it is pretty straightforward. Your second question was a good one. How can successive crops be planted in a plant plan? For example, you start planting grass, tree marigold, afterwards potatoes, followed by corn. Yeah, so this is a great question. It goes back to, what are we trying to do on that landscape? If we're just annual gardening, and so we're going to have our little potager kitchen garden, chances are we're not going to introduce a lot of technical agroforestry. We're not going to bring in trees, but we can canopy. So one of the things I've done, because I grew a herbal crop called spilanthes, which is an incredible medicinal for oral health and for viral protection. I basically supported about 10 different families in their oral health for close to 8 years by growing spilanthes and then tincturing it and creating it. But I was using kale as an overstory crop for my spilanthes at the beginning. So my spilanthes went in, my kale had already been growing, and basically they overstoried it. And then into the winter, I left them there instead of polyculturing, or pardon me, polytunneling the spilanthes, because towards the end of the season, during the first really early frosts in Canada, you can start to get a lot of dieback on the leaf, and the leaf matter as well as the buds are great for herbaceous material. So basically what you do is, first, Nicholas, think about what it is you're trying to do at the end game. So are you creating a forest? Are you creating a herbaceous line? Are you creating rows of shrubs that you're wanting to grow? Because that's the thing about Grosch's system, it all moves towards forests. So if you're not doing that, then you have to be conscientious about what type of under and overstory plants you can use. And that gets into companion planting and the great work of Elliot Coleman, for those of you in the temperate climates. For you in Colombia, I think what I would do for your design site is think, what of these areas am I happy to go to forest and have forest crops coming from? And does that support the management or the maintenance routine and the people I have for it? Or do I want to keep a lot of those systems at a smaller level so that way I can manage them? One of the things that Stefan Stobanowski and others in France have shown us is that we can train trees to be pedestrian orchards, so we can keep them quite small, either by weighting down branches and keeping them low, or by doing what's called tip budding, which is basically the new tips of all the growth of trees. Once they get to the height you want them, you basically pinch them off several times a year, and that then creates more growth back on the branch, which can also create more leaf matter and bigger fruits. This was a technique taught to me by Richard Walker of Dragon's Eye Nursery, who made an incredible 7-story food forest in Grand Forks, British Columbia, and produced an incredible site off of compacted horse pasture that was inundated with bindweed and gophers, which he will tell you, if he had to do it again, he would have not chosen that piece of land, because it took a huge amount of work to combat the different pests that were constantly eating everything. So yeah, you start there, Nicholas, and then you work backwards. So just think to yourself, what are the areas within my site that I want to work that way? And if you're keen on syntropic agroforestry, it works bomber in the tropics. The few examples I've seen in temperate climates, because of the growth rate in temperate climates, I haven't seen anything that really supports it as being the next conversation. I think probably agroforestry, as it's typically understood, works really well in those situations, but I'm always open to learning more. My exposure to syntropic agroforestry is I've worked with a couple of its practitioners as business consultants, helping them to develop businesses and develop that conversation. But I haven't had any formal training in it. Most of my training has been reading the manuals that Ernst and his 4 or 5 prime students and then the next generation that have all put out. But it's on my list now that I live down in Ecuador. It's on my list to travel down or to host one of his prime students to do an English speaking course to develop more content within it. So yeah, great question. And then do you consider that agroforestry can be applied in several zones? Is it restricted to zone 2-4? Does it change in time? Does it start with high maintenance and mature into lower frequency maintenance? Start at zone 2 when crops first rotate and mature into wooded and fruit. Yeah, so technically agroforestry can happen anywhere, but with permaculture, with the zone concept, because again, permaculture is it's a habitat land design approach. Syntropic agroforestry is really how do we grow this forest, which is a great technique. So within permaculture, the zones are frequency of use. Zone 1 is daily, zone 2 is weekly, zone 3 is monthly, zone 4 is a few times a year, and zone 5 is, we don't touch it. We just go to sea and maybe wildcraft and things of that nature. So could you have agroforestry in zone 2? Sure. Could you have it in zone 1? Maybe. It might make sense because you may have things like wind breaks or privacy breaks, or you may have a woodlot close by because it's just the best spot for it. And then technically we wouldn't call it a zone 1 because we wouldn't be going there every day. So what may happen is you may have an area that you set up as zone 1 for the first 3 to 5 years. You go there frequently, you're tending the plants, you're also tending the support crops and the alley crops in between. And then you move on and it progresses out of zone 1 to zone 2 or zone 3 or zone 4. I can't think of a tree in the temperate climates that I would naturally want to be tending every single day. So I wouldn't necessarily put agroforestry directly into zone 1. And usually zone 1 is close to or touching or just outside of zone 0, which is that center of human initiative. So I think it's possible. There's nothing in my mind that's really calling to it. The only thing would be the linden tree in temperate climates. So the linden tree is a really interesting tree. Again, I learned this through Richard Walker, that its first young shoots are like spinach. And so he used it as a tree lettuce. So he would pick them all in the spring and he would use them for tree lettuce. But after that, that tree is no longer, into the summer, that tree is going into full growth and there's no more young leaves. So yeah, I'm not really thinking much of where that might be. We did a project in Cuba a couple of years ago, similar sort of tropical, a bit more wet tropics than Colombia. But one of the things we did is, and you'll do this coming up, is we did a zone analysis existing, and then we took a look at what they wanted the zone analysis to be final, or the concept zones. And one of the main things we did is we moved their entire banana plantation to the far back of the property. They'd put it directly beside the house. And so we moved that because bananas are a herb technically, and you can cut down the upper growth, dig up the corm, which is what the root ball is called, and you can transplant it, and they're sprouting on Thursday. It goes so quick. And then we transitioned that entire area into an annual garden for lettuce and radish and all the things that the Cubans love to eat. So yeah, I think you could. I don't see reason why not, but you just want to make sure it was for the right reason, thinking that it would potentially grow up. Does that answer your questions? Any follow-ups from that? They're great questions.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and highly recommend people check out Ernst's work. It's just phenomenal. The other person you might want to check out is Scott Hall out of Australia. So if you're looking at drier climes that are still a bit more tropical, that's great teacher and educator. Yeah, so there's an opportunity there. All right. So
Javin, I have a question on that.
yeah, go ahead, Ruben.
Well, you mentioned a few times through your answers there of kind of like keeping in mind where you want to go. And I feel very unclear on that right now because my site is so dry. Like historically, it's had 290 millimeters of rain annually, and last year it had 208. So, like, the drought, climate change is hitting hard, and the climax species is ponderosa pine that is now dying back really badly because the winters are no longer cold enough to kill the pine beetle. So the climax species is dying. There is interior Douglas fir, which seems to be doing well. But I'm starting to wonder about things like trying to plan for the death of the ponderosa by planting out into zone 5. Like I'm wondering about things like Jeffrey pine or something like that.
Yeah,
But when I look,
great point.
going through the template, there's all the questions about like water flow and stuff like that. And there's like zero water flow in the land. Like there are no features of water that has collected and dug little ditches or anything like that. The only water flow is in the creek, and the whole landscape has been cut by the creek. But I see nothing like little gullies or ravines or anything like that. So and then I look at, the fields, and it's like, should I be trying to plant trees in the fields? Like, am I just like the base field landscape is kind of a lichen crust and bunch grass. And so is it just like, if I want to grow anything more, do I just have to kind of think about a world of irrigation? Like it's a future of irrigation forevermore? Or so I feel a little unsure how to vision this.
Yeah, it's the Okanagan is a rapidly drying area of Canada, as is a lot of Saskatchewan. And one of the elements of that is planning for what the predictions are showing, and thus far the A1 F1 predictions have played out from the IPCC. A1 F1 is basically we do nothing, because they have a number of ratings of like, we do a bit, we do a lot, what changes. So A1 F1 has played out pretty well. There is a great Köppen-Geiger climate prediction KMZ file off of the Köppen-Geiger website that you can download and throw into Google Earth Pro, and you can set for 25, 50, and 75. And basically, because I've done a lot of work in the northwest of North America, basically we go wet and warm for about 25 years. And then after that, we go very hot and dry. So with that in mind, knowing that we're going to hotter, drier, and we're going for a drought, basically, and we're going for micro droughts in that, in a lot of places, we're still getting our annual rainfall, but it's coming compressed. We're getting these cloud bursts, and we're not getting it in between sections. So at this point, from my perspective, just my perspective and opinion, we have to increase the organic matter in the soil dramatically to hold on to as much of that moisture as possible when we get it in larger conversations. And so my approach to your site would be to start in any of the, I think there was a little contour there, start there where you might be able to build an impoundment. And even if it's a leaky dam, even if it's something that holds water for the day that it's there and then absorbs, what'll happen is within 3 to 5 years, it'll start to create gley, GLE, gley-like soils that we see and find in wetland areas and in ponds. And so over time it will, if you don't end up putting in some kind of liner or just compressing soil, all the different ways we can do that. In terms of tree crops and tree species in your area, it's a very dry site. And what I would probably do is I would start to take a look at where might we start to irrigate that will support the trees that we want to be there. But, and this is super labor intensive, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's what we were doing at my place, is basically developing hugelkulturs to support tree crops. Because when I was working out on the West Coast on Galiano Island can go up to 5 months of drought with 0 events of rain. They wanted to, it was a nature conservancy. It was amazing. Usually the Nature Conservancy isn't interested in growing food. They're interested in saving animals, except this Nature Conservancy saw the bigger picture and said, well, wait a second, if we bring our avocados in from X, if we bring our apples in from Y, aren't we just destroying ecology someplace else? Brilliant. Nice to see somebody who sees the planet as a planet. So we did a pilot food forest there, and it's on my website under the portfolio piece, allpointsdesign.ca. And basically, I insisted that we do hugelkultur because generally, pilot projects in groups that have high turnover for staff tend not to do well. So we need to install, or like Brad Lancaster said, plant the water first. And that's what we did. We planted the water. We put in the hoogs, and the hugelkulturs made all the trees make through their first year when they forgot to water. It happened. It totally happened.
Yeah.
And so it supported it. A lot of the ground species died. You know, a lot of the small herbaceous level died, and they had to replant. But the trees were there, so the core was there. So I would think about that. I would also think about potentially working in the drainages first, if there are any drainages on your site. And I know there is, because there's that one little spot like right beside the houses here, and it's up here. I would start to take a look at developing within the drainage. And truthfully, I'd be doing hugelkultur everywhere, because it's the easiest way to front end load a huge amount of potential water holding capacity in a place that's going arid. So
Yeah.
off of the house, if you can direct that water into hugelkultur beds or into swale trails or anything like that. And then I think for long-term planting, I would be looking for probably another half step hardiness zone or a full step in your area. I'd be planting those trees. I would potentially be doing rain barrel small drip on there. So basically what this is, and again, all of these are systems that take maintenance, but if you are going to develop this system and you want to have some mainstay species there, and you do find the trees that you want to do, and you do some trials or you talk to people in the area, you place them out, you put up a 45-gallon rain barrel, you put on a little line, and you basically, you know, during the summer months, you put it on low on a little valve, and it slowly moves forward. Heavy mulched. And then I would probably do a year in advance hole construction. So this was a technique I learned off of, he ran the largest bamboo nursery in Corvallis. He was a mainstay at Lost Valley. His name is, see him. Anyways, he taught me this years ago when we were starting to plant trees, and we had time. We would do basically a layered compost pile where the tree was to be planted, and let that decompose and do its thing for a year. And then we come back and plant the tree the following year. Great way to start a tree off. We would also do a fair bit of fish fertilizer, so half fish guts, things of that nature in that area. In your area, that's a bit harder. You know, that's the other funny thing, because that's an area that, looking back in the indigenous records, people would travel through, and during times of boon would stay for a season, but then they would usually not be back for a year or two, because it wasn't a very productive landscape from a food perspective. Great for fish, not so much today, but, and that's the other piece there, and one of the reasons why we talk about, take a look at the indigenous populations that were there. And this is true. I've had a lot of Europeans get mad at me for this. We didn't have indigenous populations. You did. For the majority, it turned into you, but you did. And they had bad processes. You know, we're not trying to import specifically America's obsession with race and that conversation to other places, but everywhere had an indigenous population, even if it was a migratory indigenous population that was there and moved on. And we can learn a ton from that conversation. So those are kind of the simple low-hanging fruits I would think of. And then after that, yeah, you're taking a look at large scale irrigation. But the main thing is if you could start even starting to get a little bit of canopy and a little bit of shade, you could take off really quickly. So the main idea would be, you know, what is being grown specifically in that region that's being worked with xeriscape or dry farming. You would love dry farming. Dry farming as a technique would be something to look into, both in the the breeding of the plants and selection. I would, if I was in your scenario, and I was, because I was just 150 mil more, and then, you know, a valley east, we had sort of the main garden, which fed us, and then we had the dryland seed production garden, which is basically breeding plants to work on less and less and less and less water, saving those seeds, doing it again the next year, doing it the next year.
Yeah.
Next year. Yeah.
I've actually just recently, you know, after you see hugelkultur everywhere, and I just recently was like, oh, actually, this might be really suitable because I have a ton of branches from fireproofing, like pruning back the trees to 6 or 8 feet high.
Mhm.
So I have a ton of wood that normally it's like, okay, it's January, it's time to burn the slash pile.
Mhm.
But I was thinking like, oh, actually, this should probably be hugelkultur. But I think I might still need to water the hugelkultur to soak them.
Probably at the beginning, for sure. It's one of the reasons why I install hugelkultur in the fall, so that way they charge throughout the entire winter, and then
Right.
you start the next year. And this also brings up, if we haven't talked about it, stale seed bedding. So, you know, my hugels, I had my hugels off my shop. It was a big E. And so the shop was here like this, you know, shop's here, hugelkulturs are down here in these big tines. And basically the backside of the E was put under earth, so that way it just was like a walkway. But that was the drip edge of the shop, which I think was like 60,000 liters a year, and then the area was 60, so it was like 120. And then I would tarp my hugels with silage tarping, 3 6 mil poly, black on one side, white in the other, agricultural supply stores. I would tarp them at the end of the melt, and then would tarp them up until planting date. And that just allowed for the genetic seed bank that was in the hugelkulturs when I prepped them, which was a lot of undesirable seed, to express, die, and then took it off, put on my mulch, planted it with all of my squash. And this was the heat dome year when at our place it got to 54 degrees. Never watered them once, not once.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that sponge, if you allow it to charge and start to decompose, is really great. And for everybody else who's listening, is like, hugelkultur, what's hugelkultur? So hugelkultur is, we dig a trench, we fill it with rotting or cut wood that has been cut 2 or 3 weeks. 4 is nice, only because there's antifungals and antibacterials in wood that's living. So that way they don't get colonized when they're alive. So we have to let that dissipate. Also stay away from volatiles. So stay away from juniper, stay away from eucalyptus. If it's starting to rot already, you can include it, but generally, you know, the more volatile oil woods we want to stay away from. Pile that in. Sepp Holzer of Austria, Seppholzer, popularized this. Excellent books from him. Sepp Holzer, Permaculture is a great starting book if you're going to read him. If you want the book that will inspire you to take civil courage to a new level, you want The Rebel Farmer, also a great book. And basically hugelkultur is you dig your trench, you put in your wood. If you're doing trellises on top, you put in your uprights as you're putting the wood in. It's very hard to put in trellises on a hugelkultur after the wood is in. Then you put your soil back in, and then you usually mulch or plant depending on the time of year. So if, and this actually goes back a little bit to Nicholas's question. One of the things I like doing with clients is I like doing one hugelkultur at the first time that they're there, dig the hugelkultur, put it together. Sepp likes having his bed to be 2 meters, 6 feet tall. Reason for this is you lose 40% total of the hugelkultur over its lifespan. So it's nice to start up here and, you know, work as a bipedal upright humanoid. But we would take a bunch of annuals and a bunch of perennial seed. We would sort it by size. And then Sepp's approach was to make like a little spreader out of your hand. So you had your seed in your hand, and then you used your thumb as the lid. And he would basically broadcast. So he would lace the bed with all the same seed all over, starting with small, medium, large, because if you throw small, medium, large seed together, it'll drop at different rates. So you size them and then you spread them, you broadcast them. And he would do that for all new clients just to show them what wanted to grow where in his hugelkultur. It's very educational. So it's something I've passed on to my clients now, because if you've never grown food before, if you're in a new area, this bed, because it has the ability to hold quite a bit of moisture. And there is a tiny bit of heat that comes off of it because it's decomposing wood, very little. That's been very overhyped, but it is there. It definitely warms earlier in the season. And then basically you get to see what's expressed out of the bed by itself. So it's a pretty easy way. And I don't know if it was this class or the previous class. Somebody had just said, did you want us to take a look at a specific hugelkultur? And I think it was the other class. So I'm just going to quickly go to their meeting and see if, yeah, there we go. So we've got a big whack of hugelkultur videos coming into Feb 12th on our class. I'll put them right at the bottom here in that, and I'll also put them up in the videos section at the top. So yeah.
Do you have a recommended reading for hugelkultur as well? Like what's the...
Yeah, Sepp Holzer's permaculture is great.
Okay.
But truthfully, that's, you know, that's the end. I used to do a full day workshop on hugelkultur, and then if we did a second, we would do a design, because I spent some time with Sepp and his son Joseph, just to see it in real life. But yeah, that's a great book. Sepp Holzer Permaculture is great for reading. I should really do an article at some point or a deeper video. Both of those videos, or those sets of videos I put in there, are great. They kind of show the process at an urban scale and a rural scale. Specifically the Deep Creek hugelkultur, which ended up being like 150 feet long and like 20 feet high or wide or 10 feet tall. It was monstrous, but it had a tail that came into where the pond inlet came in. So basically it wicked up into the hugelkultur, and it became the native tree nursery for that site. They basically fenced it off, and they just plopped in all of their seeds, and they didn't do anything to it. It just self-watered the whole time. So yeah, that would be the other piece. The other thing that you may want to play with is taking a look at aerated compost extracts, getting high quality compost, or getting high quality forest soil as you get in kind of into the drainages in and around off the plain, which is super dry for you, but like into the west slope of Summerland and maybe even the east slope, getting into those drainages, grabbing some of that soil, going through aerated compost extraction process, which is taking water that's non-chlorinated, non-chlorinated, so it cannot have biocides in it, so can't come from drinking water usually. If it is chlorinated water, it can off gas in 2 days. If it's chlorinated, you have to treat it with either citric acid or colloidal silver. And then basically you take that volume, and I like using an IBC tote because they're easy to find, not easy to clean, but easy to find. You get serious about this, you go to stainless steel, and you go with a conical reservoir that comes at the bottom. And then basically you get a stiff but netted bag. And this is one of the things I just bought from a supplier, a compost tea supplier. So basically it's a big net bag, and it's rigid. So that way, when it's in the water and it's bubbling around, it doesn't twist. You can't use your stockings. You can't use like all those things you think you could use. You can't do it. And then you use a pump. I use what's called an Eco Plus 5 pump because it pushes enough air, pardon me, to go through this water. And then basically you hang that bag of compost or hang that bag of native soil into the water, and you bubble air through it. And basically it knocks around all the microorganisms, the fungi, the bacteria, nematodes, microarthropods, all those lovely folks, gets them into the water, extracts them, aerated compost extract, and then you can apply it directly onto landscape. And I would think if you wanted to do a little citizen science-y and work on a couple of specific plots just to see if that will help to jumpstart what was a very desiccated, dry, and abused landscape, that could be very useful. That could then support an understory or a pioneer crop and then move you in the right direction. You'd have to start small, get proof of concept, get a nucleated design, and then justify an investment in equipment, because you know you'll start off with a backpack sprayer and you'll want to move up really quickly if it works, but starting at a huge amount of money and time and effort isn't a great way to go about it.
Do you have any recommendations on the dry farming for resources?
You know, I'll take a look into the annals. I'm sure I have something that I had something originally. I knew a couple of folks down in New Mexico that were incredible dry farmers. So I'll put it into my notes here to do.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great question. Thank you. That in the work one. Dry farming resources. Ruben, and this is OPP. This is the, yeah. Okay. Awesome. Great question. Thank you, sir. Follow-up questions to that or additional questions that have popped up as we were speaking? Any experience with bokashi and EM? Yeah. So effective microorganisms were quote unquote discovered in Japan, late 70s, early 80s. I think the popularization of it was the 80s. And basically it was the idea that you could take facultative anaerobes. So these are working microbes that don't use oxygen, anaerobes without oxygen. And you could apply it onto a landscape, and that landscape would be improved because of the diversity and the specific types of microbes you would use. EM has been mostly popularized by buying product, but when we were working in Cuba, we would take a permaculture design course down to Cuba for 21 days. It was a cool PDC. So we got to travel from Veradero to Sanctus Spiritus to Santiago de Cuba. And we would learn along the way. We would visit farms, and then we would design and install something right at the end. So kind of similar to what we're doing here in terms of the design. The farmers we were working with would already have roughly designed it. We would have already talked to them, but we allowed the students to come up with novel and emergent ideas that would come up and really inform what we were doing. And we would put it into practice. And there was a farmer there. I forget his name now, but he was outside of Veradero, but I do have his process. And he actively cultivated EM. It was his approach to create effective, or what we now term indigenous microorganisms, directly from his landscape, create a mother culture off of this, and then use that in everything. He would put it into the water with his pigs, and his pigs wouldn't smell. It was the craziest thing. You walk through the pig pen, not a smell. He would spray it on the pig feces, wouldn't smell. It was just the wildest thing to watch and to be present to. So I will look through my archive and find that if folks are interested. Bokashi is really something that, and I've played with this on a number of different levels. I think there's other solutions for different approaches, but I really think Bokashi's best place is for urban people who want to take care of their kitchen refuse, and they don't have a great place to do it. They can't do vermicomposting. They want to work with meat because bokashi can digest meat. And basically, this is taking another step. This is totally working with facultative anaerobes in an airtight environment, putting in your refuse and allowing it to basically decompose, and then using that as fertilizer. The one thing that has been problematic about bokashi, and a bunch of the science supports this, is that it can go wrong, and then the application of that as a fertilizer can then create havoc in the landscape. So generally what I've done when I had my short little stay with bokashi, because I had the ability to compost, and I'd rather vermicomposting anyways. Vermicomposting means composting with worms. And if you want the best book ever on that, it's called All Your Worms Can Eat by Mary Appelhoff, I think. Appelhoff. That's what I'm seeing in my mind's eye. But with bokashi, you can basically keep like an airtight container. You can throw everything into it. You can add the bokashi inoculant, and it'll basically start to decompose that material. Again, from a first principles perspective, you have to think, what are we doing? Are we just getting rid of our kitchen scraps, or are we trying to high grade it to being the best it can possibly be? So in a number of areas, and Jeff Johnson of Victoria taught me this. He had an incredible nursery in his backyard, and he had a bokashi inoculator or digester where he took those metal garbage cans that had the locking lid. He dug a hole, drilled holes in the bottom of it, sunk it down so that way the lip of the garbage can was just like, a couple centimeters, an inch or so above grade, painted it flat black, and then basically used that for all of his animal scraps. So everything else went into the regular compost, but any of his vegetative scraps went in there. And then I learned that this was an amazing way for dealing with animal feces. So if you're dealing with cats or dogs or anything like that, and you're trying to find like, what am I supposed to do with this? You can use these incredible bokashi inoculators, and it will decompose that feces to the point to where I was hired to and developed a plan for the I bet you that might be actually really easy to find. For a design in Victoria called Hereward Park. Yeah, here it is. This was it's called the Dog Operational Guild. It was at that time in my design career when I loved funny acronyms. And yeah, we won't talk about that. I'll just let that be. So basically what this was this is a bokashi anaerobic digester. And it had a bunch of annual and perennial big leaf plants. So that way, and signage here. So that way you could go and you could basically pick up your dog poop and you could throw it in here and everything could stay on site and it would completely digest itself. And a number of these were compost activators and compost accelerators, things like comfrey and borage and coltsfoot. So it was created specifically for that. So that way you'd have leaves that you could rip off, go pick up Fido's deposit, pop it into the digester, and away you go. So that's been my experience with it thus far. Was there anything specific, Erica, that you wanted to ask about it?
No, I'm doing it here in the winter time because it's not so easy to compost outdoors where I live. And I think that it gives a very, then when you make it into soil, it's a very nutritious thing. But I'm a little bit split because you have to buy this, what do you call it, inoculants. And that's a cost. And I'm thinking, oh, is there any possibility that I could make this myself? But I haven't yet found that information. So that's why I'm a little bit, I haven't yet made up my mind whether I truly like it or not. I do like it, but it's also this cost, and that I'm not. I have to be dependent on someone to keep that going.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, because of the incredible output of vermicomposting, both of casting and worm juice, I definitely lean towards that. But then you still have your animal fats that you have to deal with and understand and work with. Great thing was we had dogs, and so we would basically do slow cooking with all of the bones and everything else we had, and the bones that were softened and could be just turned into dog food were thrown in the Vitamix, and we would feed a portion to the dog, and then everything else basically we would save for either soups or other things, and then we would usually put into a biochar kiln and then reduce down to biochar for the summer. Once we got there, we just freeze everything and then have it ready for the summer. So yeah, it's definitely a cost as a bokashi. So yeah, great piece. Ruben, what was used to pick up the dog crap? The leaves of the guild. So all those different leaves that I'd planted. The idea was we'd have a no plastic dog park. Yeah, never implemented, but spent a lot of time on it. All right. Other questions, comments, queries, quotations, quotients? Any other thoughts? Because if not, I will pop over to this coming week's conversation and we'll chat. And actually, Ruben's here, so this is good. I was going to talk about his excellent question anyways. So back to our trusty tutorial. Once we get into site and regional challenges, so now assignment 6, site and regional challenges, we're basically trying to understand the scope of the context of your site. So what are the problems and weaknesses of the site itself? What, from our previous SWOT analysis and our current understandings, what are the issues we might be dealing with? And then how, if can, our design approach potentially help lessen some of those challenges? This is based upon a conversation I have with all my clients, which is, what's the problem you're facing? What's the obstacle for solving that problem? And what's the cost? And the reason I ask this, for those of you that are interested in design work, is you need to understand if the problem has been contemplated to the point where they've actually figured out what's preventing them. Sometimes it's information, sometimes it's not knowing enough, sometimes it's they don't want to make the wrong mistake, but also that they're motivated enough to take action. So asking what the cost is of the unresolved problem can be important, because if it's like, I want a tree, it's not really a problem. You're not solving a problem. And so it's good to know if we're just increasing or developing a beautiful landscape or not. Cultural and social economic challenges. So understanding what these might be, what are the aspects there, what potentially could be an opportunity for the site to solve, or an income generating stream on the site that could potentially solve a problem like that. What are the strengths and opportunities, most likely disasters, and strategies for resilient that are either pre-existing or that you can think of. And then basically we're just matching problem with solution here at the end. So what's the problem and what's the potential solution? It can be at a pattern level, or you may have already been down at a strategic level, just so that way we have an overview of the site. And this again is one of the things where, let's say, compared to syntropic agroforestry or biodynamic farming is not a design site design approach. It's about how to grow food with cosmic energies. Certified organic isn't a design site approach. So permaculture is rare in the fact that it takes an ethical approach to design. And then with sector compass, what we're starting to do, and you can do it in either way. Student, I think last session or the one before, took what I had been doing originally and had given me this, and I was like, well, that's a lot tighter. So now we have options. I would suggest generally going with this format only because it's going to make moving the boxes around a mute issue, because you're basically just going to walk down this. You guys are going to be upset by the fact that these little circles are frustrating to move around, and I hear you and I understand you, and I don't know what else to say because it's not great. It's not a great solution. But if you want to even do arcs or circles, you can. Basically what I do is if I need to put in another one in the exact same spot, I basically copy and paste this and just rotate it around to the other side and put it where I need to. But that's all in the tutorial. But basically, sectors are, what are the influences that are coming into an offsite or sometimes just onto site? So this includes water flow, fire, summer sun, winter sun, pollution, wildfire, all the rest of it. There's a whole section here about going into calculating solar angles and how to get a sense of where they are in terms of their angles here and where they are in terms of their solar noon here. While we don't teach it in this class, if anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk about how I then take that into doing due diligence to make sure that tree rows don't cast shade upon other tree rows. And it's very simple. We take those angles and we basically put them into a scale drawing like you'll do in the cross section, and just seeing what the solar real estate looks like. You can also do that in three-dimensional design programs like Trimble SketchUp, but that's another process in and of itself. So basically we're getting a sense of your site. So just take a small image of your site. If you want to make it of a specific portion, that's fine. And then just where are all the areas of influence? Show us where the major centers are that we're asking for. Make sure that we've got a sense of your solar altitude at noon, and delete the other one you don't want. And then again, SWOT analysis. Pretty straightforward. Any questions about those two upcoming assignments? Tumbleweed, tumbleweed, tumbleweed. Okay, sounds good. All right, folks. Well, that's it for me, unless we have any other outstanding questions. As usual, any questions that are coming up in the next couple of weeks, feel free to put into the question and answer doc. If you have a question about a new assignment, like Ruben did, feel free just to send me an email, javin@allpointsdesign.ca. I'll answer and see it most quickly there. Putting questions in future assignments, I usually just think is somebody who's putting in a new assignment early. So I don't always check them. So thanks so much, Ruben, for sending me an email. I appreciate that. And then Ruben had a great point, which I wanted to bring up, which is sometimes the problems of the site are actually specific to the people and how they make decisions and how they interact with each other and what their needs are. It's one of the reasons why I started getting into and developing values-based decision-making, and basically saying if you were a multi-stakeholder farm, especially intergenerational, or if you're a large-scale farm and you're wanting to make good decisions, you should definitely take a look into this process. And I based it off of Alan Savory's holistic decision-making within holistic management. Basically, you get a sense about what you want to be true about the project in the future from a being standpoint. How do we want this to feel? What do we want to be true about this site? Somebody once said that I've talked more people out of farming than I have into farming, which might be true. A lot of people will watch Biggest Little Farm. They'll see a Jeff Lawton video. Now they'll see an Andrew Millison video, and they'll say, I want a permaculture landscape, or I want that permaculture farm. And they'll come to you as a designer, or me as a designer, as they did, thinking I'm a vending machine. They press the button, out comes the landscape. One of the processes I walk people through is this values-based decision-making to say, well, what is it you want from the farm? Like, what's the big why? And they'll say something like, well, I want to know where my food's coming from. I want to make sure it's clean. I want to see my kids growing up. I want to be in a natural environment. You can do a lot of that without the sacrifice of farming. It's a lot of work to farm, and not everybody's suited to doing it. And I say that fully knowing that I want there to be more small scale food producers. I don't necessarily want there to be a lot more farmers in the world. I think I do. It's a bigger question. It includes philosophy. We shouldn't get into it right now. But I definitely want to see more small scale food producers, or small scale gleaners, or dumpster divers, or like there's so many ways to get high quality food in different environments that doesn't include growing it yourself. To the point of hunting or wild harvesting, there's so many ways to increase your food shed. That when you ask people point blank, well, are you willing to give up what it takes to have this thing you want in the way that you want it? You get really quickly that, okay, well, this may not be the way that I'm going about. And that's why values-based decision-making is so important. So Ruben brought up this great question. There's some interpersonal conversations here. Is it okay to put that down as the challenge? 100%. Yeah, if that's the challenge of your site, put it on there. This happens a lot in intergenerational situations where somebody's what's called the primary decision maker who has veto, and you're the bright-eyed, back at 75% health. Nobody has a perfect back, let's be honest. And you're willing to put in all the effort into the site, but somebody else can still have veto power over you. And that's why it's important to understand the context of the situation. So you don't put in years of your life for something that may or may not actually be yours at the end of the day, or, could be washed out by somebody else's decision. So anyways, little tangent around values-based decision-making and that process, which there's actually a couple of good YouTube videos on my channel talking about it if you're interested to learn more. Okay, all right. Anything final? What are people taking away from our session today? What was the value in attending in terms of what you learned or what you took away? Feel free to unmute or throw it in the chat.
It's just such a fire hose, Javin. It's like 6 months and it's still not nearly enough time.
Yep. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It's a lifetime. That's the cool thing about permaculture. When I don't know if I said this in my intro, but I took my PDC at One United Resource Eco Village. It was taught by Jan Steinman and heavily supported by Brandon Bauer. And when I was given the prime directive, the 3 ethics, and the 12 principles, I just thought, I could spend the rest of my life here. Like I wouldn't have to go to another field. I could just constantly learn new fields and apply it to this. And yeah, I hear you. Somebody else was chatting, or?
No, it was just me, because I always want someone else to start, but usually I'm the one who starts saying something. But everyone kept waiting. So no, I just like to hear all the different perspectives and share knowledge, or to be a part of your knowledge, or to take part of your knowledge. And also, I think these are very valuable things. And I could also say that another part, I could have said that in the beginning, but I think it's also very valuable when you give feedback on others' designs. I find that very educating, and I wish that I had all the time in the world so that I could check everyone's. But that's not possible, because I find it's very eye-opening. And even if it's about something completely different than what I have, it still gives me a perspective on the things that I'm working with.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. Greatly appreciated. Anybody else want to chime in? What are you taking away from the session today? Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody. We'll see you same bat time, same bat channel in 2 weeks. Your assignments are due next week. If you have any questions, comments, or queries, feel free to drop me an email, and we'll see you in a bit. Take care.
Thanks, John.
Most welcome.